Welcome to another conversation on the future of commuting with myself, Daithí Buitléir from Park Office. Today we are joined by Alan Murphy from Smart Dublin. How are you doing, Alan?
Hey, Daithí. Thanks for inviting me along.
Oh, thanks a million for joining us. So, Alan, do you want to kick things off? Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, yeah. I am the regional manager with Smart Dublin. So Smart Dublin works with the four county councils in the Dublin area. My background is in IT consulting, and I suppose one of the projects that sort of led me to get involved in smart cities was the smart metering project, where we're all going to get a new electricity and gas smart meter into our homes. And that's happening right now. So that introduced me to the whole smart world. And then I heard about the Smart Dublin program and I joined them in 2018.
Okay, fantastic. So obviously we are really passionate here about all things to do with commuting. So do you want to tell me a little bit about the role of local authorities in managing commuter behaviour from your kind of experience?
Okay, I mean, when you talk about commuter behavior, it's there's a lot of responsibility on the transport operators, the public as well as the private ones, as well as the NTA. I suppose just to highlight the remit of the councils, which I suppose arguably indirectly affects commuter behavior. So the councils are responsible for infrastructure like the maintenance of the roads, the making parking capacity available. We're looking at a project now about, do we play a role in the rollout of EV charging infrastructure around the city region? So that's infrastructure stuff. The council is responsible for enforcement, so we would subcontract enforcement organizations to clamp people if they're not parking correctly. Then we have a network responsibility. So the councils look after traffic lights, so that's traffic management. We measure mobility, so we would work with the NTA on things like the canal cordon count, and then we also have footfall sensors and cycle count sensors, as well as vehicle counting sensors dotted around the area that count in a more dynamic way in terms of mobility. We have a regulation remit, so we license shared mobility operators like your car clubs, as well as bike sharing schemes. And e-scooters is getting a lot of airtime in the media these days, and it's probably going to be with the councils to license those operations. And then moving on to things like planning guidelines for new developments, the councils would publish guidelines on the volume of parking capacity that should be made available for new apartment blocks, for example, or housing estates. And of course, the mantra these days is to reduce car parking provision as much as possible, especially in areas where it's well serviced by public transport or other modes of transport. So the remit of the council is, when it comes to transport and mobility, is quite extensive, and it complements what the NTA and the actual operators would do in terms of affecting commuter behaviour.
Cool. No, definitely some interesting insight there. And I suppose I know from talking to a lot of people working in local governments around the world, they would actually do a lot of work at employer level to help change the dial on commuter behaviour. Is this something that you guys have explored at all, or?
Yeah, it's okay. A couple of things spring to mind there. We'd like to see ourselves sort of taking a lead and leading by example as to how a large employer might change the mindset or nudge employees as to how they might commute to work or even move around during the working day. And this is all pre-COVID-19 stuff. We're into unknown territory as to what the future commuting scenario might look like. So we had a project internally across the councils called a Smart Mobility Hub, where we provided staff um, sustainable modes of transport. So a pool of electric vehicles, a pool of e-bikes, regular pedal bikes, cargo bikes might be in there at a later stage, and just encourage people to use those sustainable modes of transport as opposed to their own private car when they're moving around during the working day. So that was a really interesting project for us as a large employer to sort of change the culture and get people thinking about how they move around during the day. And we'd like to share those kind of lessons learned with other large employers as well that might introduce similar schemes. A related project that we're working on is something called Mobility as a Service, where going beyond just large employers, it'll be trying to get our trying to integrate public and private transport operators, again, to encourage people away from the private car. And that's very much in the public domain, but there are opportunities within an organization to introduce that kind of mobility as a service, which is very similar to the project I mentioned in terms of providing pooled modes of transport to staff. But where it could go a bit further, and this is happening internationally, is the idea of mobility credits. So instead of the traditional view that somebody is given a company car as a benefit in kind, your employer might give you mobility credits that could be consumed on certain modes of transport, ideally sustainable modes of transport. So that's their concepts and projects working on that, you know, any large employer hopefully would be looking at to try and to nudge and change behavior as to how their staff would commute to their office.
Yeah, no, that's some really interesting stuff there, and definitely food for thought. You touched upon COVID there. Like, what have been the major learnings for councils from COVID in relation to changing commuter habits, and what has been done to prepare for the return to offices to make sure kind of traffic chaos doesn't come back again?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, like I said, it's crystal ball stuff, Daithí, in terms of what will be the future volume of mobility and the commuting habits. Um, it's very difficult to kind of put your finger on planning for a certain volume of activity again. And I think as a society, what we don't want is to go back to what was there pre-COVID-19, the long commutes, the high levels of congestion, etc. So, I mean, things that have happened during COVID-19 that are very obvious. I mean, the councils have invested heavily into infrastructure to support active travel. So, you know, what COVID kind of did was and there was messages, you know, communicated by different bodies to avoid public transport, for example. So in providing the kind of active travel infrastructure, so you know, cycle lanes and all that stuff, are widening of footpaths, where there was pinch points that footpaths were too narrow, and taking back some parking bays or loading bays from the street, or even the pedestrianisation of streets entirely, was an acknowledgement, you know, that, you know, if people want to move around, here are alternative and safer ways to move around, assuming that the preference might be that I want to move around in a more private way on my own bike, for example, or I want to walk. So there's some examples of acknowledging that kind of preference. But you know, hopefully, if there is a higher volume of mobility, you know, people will be comfortable to take the traditional forms of public transport and not hop in their cars. I mentioned e-scooters earlier on, and you know, I think maybe by the end of this year you might see an e-scooter scheme spun up in Dublin, and that offers just another mode for users to use. Obviously, it's a private usage of a shared scheme, but the risk factor in terms of a COVID-19 perspective is extremely low. So there's some examples that have happened during COVID, and I suppose the message there is you want to present to the resident, or even tourists when they come back, is choice as to how they want to move around the city region.
Yeah, no, very interesting stuff. And then one final question, without getting you to dust off your crystal ball again. Where do you see the future of parking in Dublin city centre going? Obviously, on a personal level, I'd say there's way too much space, and we've all these, like, there's a load of multi-story car parks lying half empty all the time, like, and it's just not a kind of good way of using space. But I'm not sure how you guys are looking at this.
Yeah, in a similar train of thought, I in the city centre in particular, there is such pressure on land use that any pockets that are underutilized, you really have to be challenging yourself as to, are we getting the most out of this public realm, or this land area? So yeah, absolutely, that the concept of parking capacity vacant for a long length of time doesn't stack up, you know. So I think in the future, so spinning it around a little bit, there's going to be a whole move, and there is already a huge move, to try and persuade people away from the usage of private cars towards shared mobility. And I get the COVID-19 sort of cloud that's hanging over us, but assuming that will pass, to try and promote shared mobility wherever possible, to try and promote active travel wherever possible. So the volume of private car activity should decrease. And therefore the supply of parking capacity, the council should look at to decrease that as well. So if someone does want to really want to drive their private car into the city centre, you're probably going to pay a premium for doing that. And we know about congestion charges in London, for example. There's talk of introducing decarbonised zones here. So if you are going to drive your car into the city centre, you're going to pay a premium to park it, but it better also be the right kind of car. It better be a low emission vehicle if you're going to do that. So there's a lot of levers and nudges away from people bringing their private car into the city centre in the first place. Therefore, we shouldn't need the capacity of parking that we currently have. And then if you want to make a leap, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years time, we may have autonomous vehicles just going around the city that are being summoned as and when you need, and they probably don't need parking. They need to park somewhere if they're idle, but the whole logistics around that is again all to be teased out. So there's a lot there,
and that's an interesting point, because it's very interesting between what experts will tell you and what Uber will tell you. So Uber have propagated this idea that, it's just going to be a forever flow or whatever. But I think the leading experts in the field will tell you that, like, if you actually think about that, that's an absolute traffic nightmare, right? So ultimately, cars will actually need somewhere to park, and they will park much more efficiently. So the concept now of having 6 cars parked blocking each other in is alien, right? Whereas if they're automated, I don't know if you remember that board game Traffic, where you'd kind of be moving the different things to avoid the gridlock. That's simple for an automated car, if that makes sense. So what you'll have is a so they'll park around 80% more efficiently, but they will actually need somewhere to park. Otherwise, you just have endless rows of cars driving around. But I think that's what
Yeah,
Uber want us to think will happen, because it probably suits their business model a bit better. But I don't think anybody else really sees it that way, you know.
yeah. And so, I mean, just off the top of my head, so imagine we do have this fleet of autonomous vehicles, and it's a shared fleet, by the way. So we hopefully we're moving away from private car ownership. Um, that they'll be most active during the day. They'll be on the move, and they just get summoned. You know, you summon your vehicle to bring you from A to B, and then it gets passed on to somebody else. But probably they'll be idle at night time. So you can imagine a couple of football fields in beyond the metropolitan area where this fleet is just kind of lying idle, waiting to start the next day. And then off they go. They feed the demand area, which would be the city centre during the day. But look,
Yeah.
we
No, it's
don't.
interesting. I suppose it's all pie in the sky. It's interesting. I'll leave you with this. It's interesting you talked about football fields. I often thought the other way around, in that you have all these car parks in Dublin city centre which don't, or like which aren't being used really in the evenings at all. And I often thought, well, Jesus, wouldn't it be great if, like, I often thought, like, if you're going to a GA match down the country and you end up parking on the spare pitch, like, wouldn't it be great if there was some multi-purpose surface that actually could be used as AstroTurf style facility in the evenings, and you could get kids in inner cities out playing basically in car parks, like, you know, within a safe environment, because you have this massive floor space that literally is just empty in the
Yeah,
evenings, and then you've no green space for kind of, you know, GA and soccer and all the different recreational stuff that does be going on. So yeah, no, it's really interesting. But sure, look, it's all ahead of us. But thanks a million for your time, Alan.
Okay, pleasure, Daithí.